Welcome, everyone, and thank you, Jose and Priya. That was terrific. Enlighten is proud to be partnered with the Kitsap Regional Library. Tonight, the Enlighten team, Barb Boas, Jill Claridge, Barbara Willock, Suzanne Holland, Carol Dudley, Karen Scott, and myself, Lynn Wilmot, are very excited to be presenting this special event, which is part of the Humanities Washington Speaker Bureau. Humanities Washington is a nonprofit organization dedicated to sparking conversation and critical thinking, and it provides many cultural programs to hundreds of thousands of people throughout Washington state each year. Thanks to support from the National Endowment for Humanities, the Washington Secretary of State, the Thomas S. Foley Institute for Public Policy and Public Service at Washington State University, and many private donors, Humanities Washington Speakers Bureau presenters visit all corners of the state. And I would encourage you to visit their website, www.humanities.humanities.org, to find other events like this one. Clarence Moriwaki is our speaker this evening. He is president of the Bainbridge Island Japanese American community and is a founder of and past president of the Bainbridge Island Japanese American Exclusion Memorial Association. Over the past 20 years, Clarence has worked to create and develop the memorial and earn designation as a National Historical Site. For his efforts in 2008, he was awarded the National Parks Conservation Association's highest national accolade, the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas Award. He was named in 2018 Citizen of the Year by Bainbridge Island Chamber of Commerce. Clarence is the principal of Forest Edge Communications, and he has served as CEO of the Japanese Cultural and Community Center of Washington, a senior aide and spokesperson for President Bill Clinton, Governor Mike Lowry, Congressman Jay Inslee, Lieutenant Governor John Cherberg, the Washington State Senate, Kitsap County Transit and Portland Rose Festival Association, and as campaign manager for the ACLU of Washington. Clarence was also a news reporter and program producer for 3 Seattle radio stations, a member of Tukwila City Council, and candidate for the Washington State Senate. He is also the state's first and only 12-year-old Eagle Scout. Please join Enlighten in welcoming Clarence Moriwaki and his timely presentation, Let It Not Happen Again, Lessons of the Japanese American Exclusion. Clarence.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Enlighten Kitsap and the Kitsap Regional Library. I'm really excited to be here and share my presentation with you. And all of you, we've been on Zoom a lot, and so you probably either made, watched, or had to participate in a slideshow, a PowerPoint presentation. So I'm giving you fair warning right now that this is a PowerPoint presentation. However, I hope that you won't find my presentation torturous. I call this the story of 4 H's: history, honor, healing, and hope. First, we start with the history of Kitsap County, and it's with the Suquamish people. They have been here for about 10,000 years. One of their most famous families was Kitsap, which of course our county is named after, but perhaps their most famous son was Chief South, who is the namesake for the city of Seattle. The first Europeans did not arrive in our region until 1792. This is a depiction of Captain George Vancouver's ship, the HMS Discovery, somewhere in central Puget Sound. And in 1841, the United States Navy came through our area. A man by the name of Charles Wilkes, a Navy lieutenant, circumnavigated the island and named it after his good friend Commodore William Bainbridge, who never set foot in Washington state. What they found in our region was natural resources, not only just from the sea, but from the land. Everywhere from Canada all the way down to Northern California were these massive old growth forests, and anywhere near the water, mills sprouted up. And that certainly happened here on Bainbridge Island. At the end of the 19th century, this is the Blakely Harbor Mill. It was the largest lumber mill in the entire world. And it brought people from all around the world to work here. Japanese, Chinese, Croatians, Swedes, Norwegians, African Americans. They all worked tight and close together in these works. And they also worked in the back there at the Hall Brothers shipyards. This brought all the people to our community. And in the late 1880s, the Census Bureau finally came to the area and wanted to make lists of all the people who lived here, but they found names like mine, Moriwaki or Yamamoto, too hard to pronounce or spell. So for many, many years, you were simply known as, let's say, Jap number 15. This is what a depiction of what that, at its peak, Blakely Harbor was. You can see in the middle of the map, there's a Hall Brothers shipyard right above the words Blakely Harbor. To its far left, you can see the mill. I'm going to focus on the lower left corner of this map, the Japanese towns of Yama and Nagaya. Nagaya is where the first Japanese workers came. And when they brought over their wives and started families, those families moved and built homes up in Yama. Yama in Japanese means hill. And here's a picture of the homes that they built. At its peak, there were about 350 people of Japanese ancestry on Bainbridge Island. And in the late 19th century, early 20th century, there was only about 3,000 people on the island. So they comprised about 10% of the population. Most came in the 1880s, most people came from other countries to work here because they wanted to work at the mill and wanted to work at the shipyard, skilled laborers. The Japanese came in the 1880s because of economic recession that was happening throughout the country, and they came for new opportunities. So many of them were professionals in the homeland, and many of them were entrepreneurs and business people. So they essentially started the company town around Blakely Harbor. Mr. Takayoshi was the mercantile leader. There was the Washington Hotel. There was a restaurant, a bathhouse, and everybody who worked at the mill shopped at these Japanese stores. So they basically really became a tight-knit, close-knit community. The most popular business that Mr. Takayoshi had was the ice cream parlor. And you can see that people took pride in their businesses, pride in their homes. The lumber mill, the Port Harbor Mill, burned down twice in its life. In the 1920s, it burned down for its final time, and most of the old growth lumber that it was consuming had pretty much been gone. So people had to find other things to do. A lot of the Japanese started strawberry farming on Bainbridge Island. For those of you who know Bainbridge Island and have ever gone down 305, where you see the strawberry field ends and you see that clear field, that's where Highway 305 is right now. And the left corner of that clear field would roughly be where the McDonald's is, where these individuals are. That would be where the Safeway shopping center complex is today. They also had other businesses. This is a picture of the Bainbridge Gardens grocery store. It also had a gas station. And of course, it still exists today, a very large and popular nursery. So everybody also shopped at their businesses as well as the other businesses. Bainbridge was a rather closed ecosystem of both society and economics, and also our state was one of the first states to have compulsory public education, which meant every child must go to school together. You can see all these children together, and I would contend that no child is born prejudiced. So the life was really humming along on Bainbridge Island, being very close-knit. And then on December 7th, 1941, the Imperial forces of Japan came to the territory of Hawaii and bombed the 7th Fleet in Pearl Harbor. On that day and the day after, the FBI went to 23 cities and the territory of Hawaii, and in less than 48 hours, and they took whatever they wanted. They had no search warrants. They had no warrants for arrest. They arrested within 2 days 1,291 people, not 1,212. And you can see the cities and maps, the number of people that they took away, mostly leaders of the community, heads of the churches, business leaders, and the rest. Wow. Now, on February 4th, 1942, I should mention, they came to Bainbridge Island, and with the assistance of the Kitsap County Sheriff's Department and the FBI, they raided all 50 homes on Bainbridge Island simultaneously and took away 38 of our elders. They did this without any warrants again, without any search warrants. Then one of the things that they were able to do this, and they went to every city. Almost every single Japanese American home was raided by the FBI, from Canada all the way down to the Mexican border. And they were able to do this, we discovered in 2007, because the United States Census Bureau had illegally given them all of the actionable data of where they lived and where all these people lived. And after, I'm sorry, here we go. On a few days after Pearl Harbor, on December 11th, 1942, the Western Defense Command was created and this is its first commander, Lieutenant General John DeWitt. And on March 2nd, 1942, he issued his first public proclamation number 1. It designated military areas on the western halves of California, Washington, and Oregon, and the southern part of Arizona. And they had a curfew imposed of all people of Japanese ancestry. They had to remain at home from 8 in the evening until 6 in the morning. We were also at war with Germany and Italy, but there were no curfews imposed on any German Americans or Italian Americans. And on February 19th, 1942, Democratic President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. And on this, he said that authorized military authorities to exclude civilians from any area without any trials or hearing, even outside the exclusion zone. A month later, after this was signed on March 18th, FDR signed Executive Order 9102. It established the War Relocation Authority, or WRA. And this was a civilian agency in charge of managing the forced removal and eventual incarceration of the Japanese Americans. And he appointed Milton Eisenhower as its first director. On March 24th, 1942, soldiers showed up from New Jersey on the island and posted, as you can see, Civilian Exclusion Order number 1. And the order stated that all persons of Japanese ancestry will be removed in 6 days. You will only be allowed what you could take or carry or wear. And a day after this, on March 25th, by the way, all the people had to come and sign up in person. So you can see the people signing up here, and anybody who's been on Bainbridge Island know where the Pegasus coffee shop is. This was the Anderson hardware store in its previous iteration. And the day after that poster was put up, this is a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Evansto Eroto showing up at the Anderson hardware store signing up. Now they're smiling in this photograph, but I would suggest and suspect that shortly after it was taken, they were not so happy, because Mr. Eroto is a Filipino American, and he was told that he could not leave with his wife since he was not a Japanese American. And he pleaded, he said he wants to be with his wife. He will do whatever you wanted. He'll renounce his US citizenship. He just wanted to be with his wife, but the law said that only Japanese Americans could go. So Mr. Eroto had to stay behind. Now they had only 6 days to decide what to do before they're going to move. So people on the island found people to look after their properties. The Japanese on Bainbridge Island owned their lands, and they signed them over to many of their friends and neighbors who were willing to take them over, and the possessions and the rest. And they waited until March 30th. That's when the ferry arrived from Seattle. They had to go to the Eagle Dell ferry dock. This was a picture of the soldiers gathering at the Winslow ferry dock. And if you could not get to the Eagle Dell ferry dock on the south side of the harbor across from Winslow, they would take you in trucks if no one gave you a ride. Everybody had to go, no matter what your status in life. Here were the orphans that lived on the island. And the oldest person on the island at the time of Japanese ancestry, Reverend Hirakawa on the right. He is 77 years old in this photograph. This is a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Moji. They were a childless couple, and she was in her 40s, he was in his 50s. It's not been told whether she was unable to conceive or they chose not to have a child, but they always had one dog as their child, if you will. And King was well known on the island. You can see he was a white Samoyed, which is rather exotic at the time, and King wanted to go with his parents, if you will, but pets were not allowed to go either. So after this photograph was taken, these two soldiers to the right pulled King out, and for the first time in the 6-year-old dog's life, he started to bark and tried to bite these soldiers. and they had to restrain the dog as the Mojis were driven away. The Mojis, like the other Japanese American farmers on Bainbridge, had someone look after their property, and their neighbor also said and pledged that they would look after King. But King was so despondent that he refused to eat or drink, and he died in about 6 days. This is a picture of Mrs. Fumiko Hayashida. She's 31 years old in this photograph. She's holding her 13-month-old daughter, Natalie, and she is pregnant with her third child, Leonard, who would eventually be the first Japanese American baby born in a concentration camp. This picture is iconic. It's been seen around the world. It's really one of the pictures that whenever they talk about the Japanese American incarceration, they use this picture. And she played a big role in our community. And I'll talk about her later. The soldiers became very close to the Bainbridge Islanders in this time, and they were really helpful to the people in any way they could. And seniors from the high school skip school to say goodbye to their friends. These students, by the way, everyone's wearing multiple layers of clothing because they could only take one suitcase. So they wore their summer clothes under on top of their fall clothes, etc. The soldiers did become close. Walt Woodward, who is the publisher of the newspaper, reported that he talked to the commanding officer that day. And the commanding officer said, "We don't know why we're here. We don't know why we're doing it to these people. This is the hardest thing we've ever had to do." And Woodward added, "Every soldier had tears in their eyes." The boat was finally arriving. This is the Eagle Dale Ferry dock. You can't see the dock. It's just off to the left of this photograph at the end of where the last truck is. You can see the cars where the people gathered. The friends brought them, and the soldiers marching down to meet the ferry. The ferry Colocan arrived at 11:03, and 227 Japanese Americans marched down to the ferry Colocan. They had to say goodbye to their island, and they arrived in Seattle to these trains. And you can see the thousands of people that came to watch them. This is the Hayashida family saying goodbye to the island. And they went for 3 days and 2 nights with the blinds closed, not knowing where they would going, how long they'd be gone, or even if they get to come back. And they showed up here in the high Sierra deserts of California, a place called Lone Pine, where they then boarded buses, drove for another couple hours, and then arrived here at Manzanar, the first concentration camp. And you can see it was still under construction. And this picture, they arrived on April Fool's Day, April 1st, 1942. If you can possibly see the writing on the lower left of this picture was literally taken the day after they arrived. And these barracks were very hastily put up. They were in these small apartments of 25 feet by 20. And they had these bare cots. They had one light bulb and a wood stove. Everybody, since they could only take what you carry away, they gave everybody very large sacks and a smaller one, and their large bales of hay throughout the camps. Everybody was directed to fill up these sacks with bales with their hay, and the larger sack would serve as your mattress, and the smaller one would be your pillow. And you may do the best you could. This is a model of what Manzanar looks like. This is at the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. And by September 1942, more than 10,000 Japanese Americans were crowded into 504, these 504 barracks. You can see they're organized in blocks. There were 36 of them. Each barrack was 100 feet by 20, broken up in 4 sections, thus the 25 by 20 foot apartments that everybody was living in. You can see also in those blocks of the barracks, in the center of them, there are 2 smaller buildings. That was the male and female latrines. The longer building was the mess hall, and then the smaller one to its right would be the shared laundry facility. All of these camps were in very desolate places throughout the country, as far east as Arkansas. But the one thing they had in common is they were very hot in the summer and windy. The Manzanar people and talk about the sandstorms. And in the winter, of course, no roads, no pavements, so it would be muddy, cold and freezing. No insulation, just tar paper on the outside of these barracks. And there was no partitions between the toilets. This was a very hard thing, especially for the first generation Japanese Americans who really prided themselves in modesty and privacy. All 10 camps have various stories of how people dealt with their incarceration, but every one of the 10 camps shares a story of seeing some elderly person marching to the latrine at 2 or 3 or 4 in the morning and then coming back. It's not that these people were noisy. it's because the searchlights would be panning the camp all night. But when someone would leave, of course, those searchlights would spot you as if you were on the middle of a Hollywood stage and follow you all the way to the latrine, keep the spotlight on the latrine, wait till you leave and follow you all the way back. And so people would wake up and look out their windows and watch this thing happen. And the reason why a lot of these elderly people would do that was it was the only time they could be alone. They wanted some modicum of dignity. So that was a very hard thing for the elders to deal with, and I suspect almost everybody to deal with. And another thing, they ate together in these large barracks, which Japanese families usually always ate together. That was a tradition where you got together, the family would gather and share stories and go together. But in camps, you didn't. You ate with strangers, and not only that, but the children would find other friends at other parts of the camp, other blocks where the food was better, perhaps in that block, or the boys and girls were cuter or whatever. And so the family started breaking up. That nuclear family wasn't able to be cohesive, which was also another straining point for the elders. But a lot of them said that was okay because they wanted their children to have as normal a life as possible, because they did not know how long they'd be here, 2 years, 5 years, 20. And so they wanted to make sure they had all the activities for their children that they would have outside of the barbed wire. And at the top of the list was education. They would convert barracks into classrooms. Eventually, the government would make sure that they had the educational materials they needed. And they had all the other activities that you would have outside of the camps, and make dances and have sports and the rest. And here in Manzanar, they had girls play basketball outside. And again, all 10 camps had different ways of how to deal with their time in incarceration, but all 10 camps had one thing in common. They all had a love of baseball, and the incarcerees themselves would build their own diamonds. Here are thousands of people gathered around the Manzanar baseball team, which, by the way, played teams from outside colleges, high schools, military teams. Manzanar teams were undefeated. Here's a picture of what the camp looks like from the outside. You can see the guard tower up in the distance. And this is a map of the forced removal. You can see on this map the dark red line that in Washington is basically the Columbia River, where it goes sort of straight up. That's a town called Brewster, and the Highway 75 all the way to Canada. In Eastern Oregon, it went out the Hood River and the Bend in Eastern Oregon, all of California and southwestern Arizona. If you are on the left side of that line and 1/16 Japanese American, you're going to be taken away. And then that's 114,000 people on the west side of that area. And then you can see the triangles on this map all the way out to the east to Arkansas, Aurora, and Jerome. These are the location of the 10 major concentration camps, of which all those folks went to. Over the course of the year, over the 3.5 years of incarceration, nearly 6,000 babies would be born during that time in one of these concentration camps. So all told, it was 120,000 Japanese Americans who were forcibly removed and excluded from the West Coast, or nearly 95% of all Japanese Americans who were in the United States at the time. There were some Italians and some Germans who were arrested for things against the country, but it was only about 14,000. There were 10,000 Germans, 14,000 Italians. There were more than 14 million Italian Americans and Germans. There are 10 million German Americans and 4 million Italian Americans, less than 1% of those people being incarcerated. And you can see the Bainbridge Island route. As I mentioned, they went straight to Manzanar after about a year. Most of them transferred to the Minidoka concentration camp in southern Idaho, which became the last camp in this whole story, placed in the last block. So Bainbridge Island is literally the first ones into the first camp under construction, placed in one of the last blocks, in the last barracks of one of the last camps to be constructed. So they're literally the bookends of the incarceration story. Now, they went straight to the concentration camp, but people on Bainbridge said, well, at least we didn't have to go to an assembly center. All of those 10 triangles, as you saw Manzanar being under construction, they could not build those camps fast enough. So they had temporary holding facilities to hold them until the camps were ready for occupation. And here in Western Washington, you can see the orange in this map. Those are Seattle and Pierce County. They went to the Puyallup Fairgrounds. In dark blue, Kitsap County and most of King County went to the Pinedale Assembly Center in Fresno, California. And in green, the rest of Western Washington went to the Tule Lake Assembly Center in Northern California, which later became a permanent concentration camp. And there are other places. They went to the Santa Anita Racetrack and the fairgrounds, state fairgrounds in California, the Portland Racetrack. They did not have barracks ready for them as well. So the first several thousand who showed up at these fairgrounds or racetracks had to go and live in the livestock bins, whether it was, where horses or pigs or cows had just previously lived. And they didn't completely clean them out either. So after the camps were built, they finally started having this distribution. And you can see here in Washington, the red, Seattle and Pierce County went to the Minidoka camp. That's why Bainbridge Islanders wanted to go there, because they had a lot of friends and family from Seattle. The rest of Western Washington were already at the Tule Lake camp, which became a concentration camp. And Eastern Washington and the blue area, all those folks went to Heart Mountain, Wyoming. At its peak, they were very large cities. In Wyoming, the camp there was the largest city in Wyoming at the time during World War II. Now, campus life was moving along and people tried to do the best they could. This is Keisakaina Cow with their firstborn, Bruce. She just passed away last year at 100 years old. And as the war was going on, the military wanted to come and needed more people to fight the war. So even though the FBI raided and took their shotguns and all the rest because they couldn't be trusted, they came to the camps and asked Japanese American young men, would you enlist to be in the war? This is a picture of Art Kuro with Flo, his wife, and he was one of the Bainbridge Islanders who enlisted. Out of the 276 Bainbridge Island Japanese Americans, more than 68 had signed up or drafted to the US military. There was 66 men and 2 women. And Art was one of the 18 on Bainbridge Island who served in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. This is an all-segregated unit of Japanese Americans who fought in Europe. And they had one turning point in the war that was very famous. There was a battalion of Texans called the Lone Star Battalion. They were famous. They were tough rangers, cowboys, ranchers, and all of that. But they got pinned down by the Germans on 3 sides in northern in Italy, and they were caught. The 442nd showed up after fighting a 5-day battle, and they gave them 1 day rest. Now, there had been 2 full-blown attempts by the Allies to rescue the lost battalion, but they were pushed back by the German forces. They gave the 442nd 1 day rest and said, go save these men. And they were successful. It took them 6 days, and they did save 211 out of the 275 Texans from the lost battalion. But from the 442nd, 161 of them died, and 1,200 had casualties, and 42 of them were captured by the Nazis. I bring this up because not only is it extraordinary brave efforts, but it was so well covered by the media that it was kind of a turning point in America back home, where all these white Texans were saved by all these Japanese Americans, and people had a different view of what it meant to be an American. And so a lot of people started to have a different appreciation for what the Japanese Americans were in this country. Now, units in the military history have what's called a presidential unit citation, where out of extraordinary valor, whether it's a ship, a group of soldiers or whatnot, did something so extraordinary, that unit, that the president cites them out. Only 5% of all military units in military history get the presidential unit citation. The 442nd received 7 of them. And this is a picture of Harry Truman giving them that 7th presidential unit citation. And he said at that day, you not only fought the enemy, you fought prejudice, and you won. Now, all of these soldiers, some of them enlisted and then others were drafted. But even before you could get drafted, they had to fill out a loyalty questionnaire. And you can see the 2 questions here on your screen. Are you willing to serve in the armed forces? And some of these young men said, but I'm a US citizen. I'll fight for our country if you give me my freedoms and rights and let my family out of this camp. And so some young men said, that's insulting, and I'm not going to say yes to that. I will say no. The second question is the loyalty questionnaire. And you can see it says forswear any allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor or any other foreign government power. And a lot of them said, who the hell is the Japanese emperor? I mean, these are young American guys. They're lettermen in their high school and the rest. They had no idea who that was. And they were insulted by that you'd think that. Also by forswearing, it assumes that you had a previous allegiance. You can't unswear or forswear something you had no swearing of allegiance to begin with. So by saying you forswear almost implies that you did have previous allegiance. And again, some young men felt this was again insulting, and so they would say no. This caused a lot of friction within the families because of all of the prejudice they'd been seeing through their lives. They wanted their sons to be loyal. So answer yes. And some families had young men who said yes, yes to these questions, and some who said no, no. And if you answered no, no, you became known as a no, no boy. And they became outcasts. They were taken to the Tule Lake concentration camp, which became an incarceration center. They were considered the most disloyal, and they took their families there with them. These are three of the probably most famous, if you will, no boys: Gordon Hirabayashi, Minoru Yasui, and Fred Korematsu. Fred Korematsu, both in California. Minoru Yasui was from Hood River, and Gordon Hirabayashi was here in Seattle, in the White River area, UW student. Mr. Hirabayashi, Mr. Yasui both said they didn't go with a curfew. They stayed out past curfew, saying it's unconstitutional. We're both not only American citizens, but if we're at war with these two other countries, Germany and Italian, how come they aren't under curfew either? They were arrested, convicted, and their convictions were upheld by the US Supreme Court. Mr. Korematsu decided not to go to the camps. He hid out with his Italian-American girlfriend, but he was later caught. He was captured, he was convicted, and he was tried. He also appealed his conviction to the US Supreme Court. That was a split decision, 6-3, but he was still saying that the executive order was fully constitutional. Now, again, we were at war with these two countries, Nazi Germany, Italy, and none of them had these mass exclusion orders. It would have changed history for a lot of Italian Americans, like this Italian American, Joe DiMaggio of the Yankees, or this German American, Dwight Eisenhower, who was the five-star Allied general that led the Allies to victory over Germany, Japan, and Italy, and he later became a US president. I'm pointing out this is unconstitutional because you can see in the Fourth Amendment, this is where you must have a search warrant. You must have a reason to enter your property or take something from you. The government cannot do this without some sort of court authorization. All of those raids on Bainbridge Island and everywhere else, there's never one search warrant was ever issued, and they took lots of property. The Fifth Amendment is quite powerful. You can read it for yourself. So no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So I understand it of all democracies, all republics who have governing documents. None of them say persons' rights. They all say citizens' rights. That means in the United States, when you cross the border at Canada or Mexico, or you get off a cruise ship in the port of Seattle, or get off a plane at SeaTac, no matter how you got here to this country, the minute you set foot on American soil, you are protected by the Constitution. There must be a due process. The government just can't do what they will to you. And all of the first generation people were persons. They were denied citizenship. They could not naturalize until 1951. But the 14th Amendment is the one where you are if you're born naturally in the United States, you are a natural born citizen. Out of those 120,000 Japanese Americans, 75,000 were born here. They were the children. They were US citizens. And yet the convictions of Yasui, Hirabayashi, and Korematsu were all upheld by the Supreme Court. And J. Edgar Hoover, who had been surveilling all of these Japanese Americans of 1/16th ancestry since the mid-1930s, had said, I got nothing. I'm more worried about these German bunt and these Nazi sympathizers. And his own Attorney General Biddle here said, Mr. President, this is illegal. We'll have 75,000 lawsuits. Yet somehow the Supreme Court said, no, you're wrong. So one of the ways they were able to do that was in the documents. It had this definition of persons no longer being persons, but you are an alien or non-alien. It was a new subclassification of what it means to be a person. And so that was one of the things that the Supreme Court could hang their hat on, saying during times of war, the laws become silent. And what we need to do to protect our country, we sometimes take extraordinary means, even if it is this reclassification. So that was one of the ways the Supreme Court could justify an unconstitutional action. Everyone knows this phrase. We hope to remember it. And at the Manzanar National Historic Site, you enter the site, you see this picture of the USS Arizona sinking above the, superimposed over a picture of the Twin Towers after they fell on the island of Manhattan. And this is how a lot of people reacted after after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And here's how a lot of people reacted after September 11th being attacked by terrorists. Now, in order to get people to kill on demand, unless you're a psychopath or a sociopath, you don't do that. So militaries, governments try to make your enemies so evil. And the Germans in World War I truly elevated it to an art form. You can see here the dark, menacing Bolshevik and the knife and the German mother being threatened. And so that's one way to make your enemy so sinister, or make your enemy not even human. Here the British are this spider invading Germany coming across, and many other propaganda posters, quite frankly, some you might call pornographic. And we found that so awful that we swore as a nation that we would never stoop to that level because it was just so dehumanizing and certainly un-American. But after World War II started, and after September 11th, this next item I'm going to show was something that was considered incredibly patriotic, kind of like how we wear yellow ribbons today, or perhaps a USA flag lapel pin. And these are handed out by businesses as commercial promotions, as schools for spirit awards, churches, civic organizations. And after September 11th. This next one was given out by the United States Marine Corps after recruits and others passed their marksmanship classes. This was one from the training camp in Hawaii. This is a fundraising appeal by a candidate for governor, a Republican candidate. He did win. He got thousands and thousands of dollars from these $10 donations for these bumper stickers. But he was defeated. I mean, he was removed from office a year later for some other discretion. And this is from the pretty progressive university, George Washington University, about a month after the September 11th event. So 40 years after the war, people started thinking about what was happening in this time. And my generation, the third generation, said this was something that we should really address. So in 1976, the final year of President Gerald R. Ford, Republican from Michigan, he started a bipartisan commission. He said, on July 4th, 1976, the bicentennial year of our Declaration of Independence, that was a day he chose to eliminate or exclude 9066, the executive order. He rescinded it from the books. He said this was a wrong action and it's no longer going to be part of the record that our country did. And that emboldened a lot of Japanese Americans to say, let's visit this. Later that year, he was defeated by this man, President Jimmy Carter. He was a governor from Georgia, and he took this up and he said, I'm going to start a bipartisan commission and bring in all the experts, bring in historians, bring in legal scholars. Let's examine this record. What really happened? And it was called the Commission on the Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians. But later that year, he was defeated by the Republican governor from California, Ronald Reagan, who continued that commission. He didn't have to, but he did. And they completed their study. In December of 1982, they published a report called Personal Justice Denied. After 750 witnesses, this 467-page report said that there was, quote, no documented evidence of espionage or sabotage, nor was there any military necessity for the mass exclusion and incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans. But this commission, after those 3 years of work, said it was based on these three things, their unanimous decision. And this led to what was called the Redress Movement. And you can see here, those three men. I mentioned Mr. Korematsu, Mr. Hirabayashi, and Mr. Yasui. Mr. Korematsu is on the left. Mr. Hirabayashi is in the center, and Mr. Yasui is on the right. They're in the back row there as they started what was called the Redress Movement. We also went through a legislative process. These are the legislative leaders and the Congress at the time in the front row, and Japanese American Citizens League and other community leaders in the back. And they worked hard for this. And in August 10th, 1988, the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 was signed by President Ronald Reagan, sitting there, which led to a lot of healing and finally honor of this moment. On Bainbridge Island, we want to honor these two people, the publishers and editors of the Bainbridge Island Review. They started their paper in 1941, and they editorialized from the beginning of the war that when the Pearl Harbor was bombed, let's not rush to mob rule. When Roosevelt signed an executive order, he said this was blazingly unconstitutional. He's the only newspaper that held that stance throughout the entire war. And he also did something else. He had people write back from the camps. So every week there was a small story of whatever happened to their friends and neighbors back in barbed wire camps. So it's the only newspaper that ever published what was going on, the only one outside of the camps that had a record of what was happening inside the camps. Because of that support and because of that editorial leadership, he lost subscribers, he had death threats. But because of that, it helped make it a very tight-knit community. Out of the 276 Japanese Americans on Bainbridge, 150 came back, and had more of them been able to own their farms or had someone look after their property, we would have been in the low 200s. There's not a community that was anywhere close to 15% return. Places like Bellingham passed official resolutions saying you were forbidden to return. So Bainbridge was so different, and it was very welcoming, but it wasn't Pollyanna times. This was a pamphlet put together by Lambert Schuyler. You can see its title. He was a white supremacist, and this pamphlet was rather popular. I saw it in the museum in San Diego. This book chronicles her story, written by their daughter, Mary Woodward. Please look it up. It's in the Kitsap Regional Libraries. It's a fabulous read. I mentioned this woman before, Fumiko Hayashida. Here she is later with her daughter, Natalie. And she's on the right. She's probably about 96 in that picture, and in front of their home. When we were going to try to make this place memorable, we didn't care if it was a national park or a landmark, a monument. We just wanted some sort of recognition. And so we went for a National Historic Site. We asked her, Fumiko Hayashida, to testify, and she's 95 years old there testifying. And with her support and support from people from all around the country, we had unanimous votes every time, co-sponsored. Sounds like science fiction now, but we did then. It became a National Historic Site in 2008. What we hope it is a place of healing. And here's a picture of those 227 marching down to the ferry. We built it at the very site where they marched down to the Malak. You can see the site. This is the former Eagledale Ferry Dock on the very western edge of Pritchard Park. You come to the site, you see these interpretive panels. We have a timber frame pavilion with all the panels in the background that explain the story as I've just told you. You walk down to the site, you come to these three panels, which depict March 30th, 1942, just that morning. And there are plenty of wonderful pictures, the most documented removal. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer came over with tons of reporters and photographers. That's why it's so well documented and so well photographed. You enter through a gate, and here is the beginning of the wall, out of granite and old growth red cedar. And you can see the name Nidoto Nayoni, or Let It Not Happen Again. From this point in the wall all the way to the end, it's exactly 276 feet, 1 foot for every Japanese American who lived on the island at the time of the war. And here's the introductory panel that tells you the story here. All of the families are put together by their names and ages. And these relief panels, this one reads, I came to Bainbridge Island in 1908. Bainbridge was a good place to raise a family, Tomokichi Nishinaka. This panel on the left, it says, above the high school, I was born and raised on Bainbridge Island, and I'm a 100% American citizen. We will protect our flag, the United States flag, Misaki John Nakata. On the right above the baseball mitt, it reads, just a week before we were to leave, Coach Pop Miller put in all of the Japanese Americans. Despite our errors and not hitting, he let us play the whole game. We lost 15-2, Paulo Taki. Above the heron, it reads, I felt like a second-class citizen to be herded onto the boat by soldiers with bayonets. It was the most humiliating experience in my life. And by the suitcase, it reads, we were really careful. We were prisoners and they had guns with spears. Fumiko Nishinaka Hayashida. This is my favorite panel. It has barbed wire in front as the girl stares through it. And on the left, it reads, the searchlights played on our windows back and forth all night. I couldn't sleep. Asami Nakao. On the right, back home at graduation, they had 13 empty chairs on the stage. That day, I felt so empty and sad. I sat on my bunk and I cried. Nobuko Sakai Omoto. You come to this part of the wall and you see there's no wall. What this represents is a time when there are no Japanese Americans on Bainbridge Island, thus no wall, but in its place is this basalt monolith, which represents the Minidoka concentration camp in Idaho, where they spent the last years of their incarceration. You have an exit panel that tells a story, and then you have the final panel, which you'll see are three big panels, full color. We want it to be bright because this is something you can celebrate of how Bainbridge Island stood with their friends and neighbors and welcomed them home. And on this first panel, it reads, I was kind of afraid, but the neighbor girl that I used to play with came up and welcomed me, Ikio Suimatsu Shibiyama. The next panel, we put the farm under Mr. Raber's name while we were gone. When we came back, he returned it to us, Nobura Kura. And the final panel, my father and his brother worked so hard to build up Bainbridge Gardens. When we returned, there was nothing left. It must have broken him, Junko Harui. You leave the site and you come on this return path and you'll see these panels, which are put together by the National Park Service. Windows were broken, personal belongings were all ransacked. My father wanted us to come back. Bainbridge was our home. So we came and we made up our minds that we had to start over. We were thankful that we had our land. The exclusion, removal, and detention inflicted tremendous human cost. There was the obvious cost of homes and businesses sold, as well as injury to careers and professional advancement. But most important, there was also the loss of liberty and the personal stigma of suspected disloyalty. Personal justice denied, report on the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, 1982. For these fundamental violations of the basic civil liberties and constitutional rights of these individuals of Japanese ancestry, the Congress apologizes on behalf of the nation, the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. For here we admit a wrong, here we affirm our commitment to a nation, to equal justice under law, Ronald Reagan signing that Civil Liberties Act in 1988. I offer sincere apology for the actions that unfairly denied Japanese Americans and their families fundamental liberties during World War II. Bill Clinton Presidential Letter of Apology in 1993. You leave the site, you go across and you come back to where the pavilion entered, and here's what we have for our future plans. We hope to have an outdoor amphitheater where we can see people to give the story. We also have a timber-framed green roof building for our visitor center with interpretive materials and to have that kind of same timber frame architecture that you see on the pavilion, the gates, and the wall. So this is what we want to leave you with. This is a story, what we hope is hope. And this is the Pledge of Allegiance as it existed in 1942. The phrase under God was not added until 1951. And at the bottom of this quotation, it reads, I wonder who the next exception will be. If this democracy with her extraordinary constitution could imprison people only because of their ethnic background, it could happen to anyone again. And it could happen to anyone black, brown, yellow, or white. Senator Daniel K. Inouye, the first senator from Hawaii, who was part of that 442nd, and he literally left his right arm fighting the Germans in Italy. This is the quote from my mentor, Dr. Frank Kitamoto, at one of his last public appearances before he passed away. And this was his final closing line, and I think he is correct. I think that fear is what's driving a lot of the hate, the prejudice, the white supremacy, all of the rest. Fear is driving what's going on, and it really shouldn't. And this phrase, Nido to Nayoni, let it not happen again, is not just our motto. It's not just aspirational. We want this to be a call to action. We want this to inspire people to do the right thing. Bainbridge Island was a different place that stood by their friends and neighbors, that welcomed them, looked after their properties, and they were doing the right thing. They had their friends and neighbors' backs. They stood by their sides. They made sure that their constitutional rights were protected, that their friendships would continue, and that their community continue and grow. We hope you can be inspired by what Bainbridge Island did, even in light of the tide of racism and fear and prejudice that happened then. That's what this motto is. It's an aspiration, and we hope it's an inspiration for a call to action when other injustices happen to others. Thank you very much. Before you ask questions, I just want to thank everybody for tuning in and spending your evening with me tonight. I'm really flattered that you chose to have some time to listen to this story.
Well, for one thing, we thank him very, very much for a lovely presentation. And I think then that we'll just remind everyone that they can put their questions or comments in the chat box.
And hope you pull out the Humanities Washington questionnaire. That helps, the organization helps get feedback from me on how this went. So that's really useful. I think this is really contemporary because we're living in a time of fear now. I mean, we have the fear we're all living with this incredible pandemic and how it is affecting us. But we just saw an outgrowth of fear just last week, an incredible seditious insurgent on an attack on our nation's capital, and our nation's capital being attacked by Americans. It hadn't been done since the War of 1812. It's been over 100 years. And it's people who are fearful of what our nation is becoming. The white supremacists don't like the multicultural diversity that's happening in America. They want it to go back to the days of yore. And a lot of that was on display, sadly. So this model, let it not happen again, it's a positive one, but unfortunately it isn't working because in some ways it is happening again. And this virus has put my community, anybody who's Asian, under duress because there's someone who keeps calling it a China virus, the Chinese virus, the Kung flu. It's terrible. And I've had a personal affront with this. I'm taking care of a friend in Everett who is soon will be dying, and I have to do shopping for him late at night at the stores. I go at Safeway before 10:30, and as I was going in just 3 weeks ago, these two men were being escorted out because they refused to wear masks, and they were very belligerent, and they almost spit at me, but I do wear a face shield. I go out like a spaceman. He said, it's because of you effing you, we have to wear this effing mask. And then they were leaving the store. That was startling to me. I just wondered if I had showed up 5 minutes later instead of walking in the store and meeting them in a dark parking lot. And that's a real thing. So live up to what Bainbridge did. Have your fellow citizens' backs, and don't kowtow to fear.
We have two questions here.
Sure.
One was, or a note here is that a farewell to Manzanar was required reading for many time in the high school in California. That's a comment. And there's another question that about one of the most disturbing things you spoke about was the Supreme Court's upholding this illegal action. And this is why I'm worried, and I wonder whether you're worried now that something that our Supreme Court would be upholding clearly illegal acts again.
Boy, there's a lot to unpack there. By the way, the executive order and the Supreme Court decisions with President Ford rescinding it, it's kind of like the third rail. You don't touch that. And yet I've seen it. They've come close. When they did the Muslim ban, they started using the Korematsu case as one of the standards. The government can do extraordinary things in times of war and safety, blah, blah, blah. And Justice Sotomayor gave him a dressing down and said, are you nuts? I mean, basically, she said that. This has been so proven wrong. And Justice John Roberts did say, you're right. And it was in the oral decisions that he said Executive Order 9066 is unconstitutional. But yet in their decision, they still referred to it. So there's a jujitsu that you said it was unconstitutional, you were going to use it as a precedent. So I don't know how you do that. They did it. So I am worried about this stacking of courts, and people keep in mind, it's not, people talk at the Supreme Court, which is the big deal. I mean, that is huge, but there's 140 or 150 for life federal court appointments of people, and many of them not even qualified by the bar. Many of them never even been in a courtroom. I mean, not even for a traffic ticket. And now they're federal judges. That concerns me a lot more, not just for constitutional issues, just for the competency and where our decisions are going to be for a while. That's longer than any presidential election, because they're going to be there for generations.
There's also many comments thanking you for your presentation and saying how timely it is and that it's necessary for citizens to be aware of and take to heart. So I think that that's a really big point.
And another thing I'd like to, not to be so gloomy, but you notice the wonderful comments from President Ronald Reagan for Ford to rescind this. We are a great country, and one of the great things that makes us great is we screw up a lot, but we come around, and when we make a mistake, we kind of own up to it. And so this was a step. I mean, it shouldn't take 40 or 50 years to admit your mistake, but our country did do this. The problem, though, is we still haven't learned from it. I mean, and we saw this in the previous election. The Civil Rights Act and slavery is gone, and yet Jim Crow efforts still continue in certain states. So we still got a long ways to go, but our country is evolving, and I feel good about that.
Thank you again very much. It was a wonderful presentation.
Again, thank you, Kitsap Regional Library and Enlightened Kitsap. Thank you for inviting me in. And again, to all the people who tuned in, thank you for sharing some of your evening with us tonight.